What's on the agenda of the EU Commission for 2026? Here's a clear summary of what's on the agenda of the European Commission for 2026, based on the official 2026 European Commission Work Programme, Europe's Independence Moment, the joint legislative priorities and related developments. 1. Core priorities of the 2026 Work Programme. The European Commission's 2026 Work Programme, adopted on the 21st October 2025, sets out its main legislative and policy agenda for the year. It is structured around major strategic goals aimed at making the EU more sovereign, resilient and competitive. A more sovereign and independent Europe, with emphasis on sustainable prosperity and competitiveness. Defense and security, social model and innovation, quality of life, food, water, nature. Democracy and the rule of law. Global engagement, trade, foreign policy. These areas reflect the Commission's focus on future-proofing the EU against geopolitical and economic challenges. 2. Key legislative and policy initiatives in 2026. 2.1. Competitiveness and economy. Promoting EU competitiveness across sectors, including industry modernization and innovation. Simplification of EU regulation to reduce burdens on businesses. Focus on implementing recommendations from the Draghi Competitiveness Report. 2.2. Defense and security. Strengthening the EU's defense posture and readiness with initiatives tied to Rearm Europe and defense collaboration. Boosting security of critical infrastructure and EU common borders. Supporting Ukraine and wider security cooperation. 2.3. Research, innovation and digital. New legislative acts planned, for example, European Research Area Act, European Biotech Act 2, Quantum Act. Continued rollout of digital autonomy measures and infrastructure laws aimed at reducing reliance on non-EU tech platforms. 2.4. Social policy and quality of life. Quality Jobs Act to modernize employment protections and labor conditions. New anti-poverty strategy and affordable housing initiatives. Actions under the European Strategy for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Education and skills support, including future digital education roadmap. 2.5. Migration and border management. Implementation of the Pact on Migration and Asylum. Strengthening EU border agencies like Frontex and Europol. Digitalization of migrant return processes. 2.6. Democracy and rule of law. Measures to protect democratic institutions, transparency and judicial standards across the Union. Legislative work linked with elections, civic oversight and media freedom, implicit in broader political guidelines. 2.7. Global engagement and trade. Securing new trade agreements and deepening strategic partnerships, for example, support for Mercosur deal negotiations. Strengthening EU's global role in climate diplomacy, humanitarian aid and development. 3. Budgetary and financial priorities for 2026. 2026 EU Annual Budget Agreement emphasizing defense, competitiveness, digital transition, research, innovation, migration, and climate spending. Ongoing discussions on the next multi-annual financial framework, MFF, 2028-34, central to future funding decisions. 4. Research and innovation funding, Horizon Europe. The Horizon Europe Work Programme 2026-2027 was adopted with significant funding. 14 billion euros available for research and innovation. At least 35% dedicated to climate action and related goals. New calls supporting industrial decarbonization, climate technologies and AI in science. 5. Plans and actions. 5.1. Recent immediate actions, early 2026. Proposal to give member states early access to agricultural funds to support farmers, linked to broader budget and trade deal priorities. Special meetings of agriculture ministers to build consensus on the Mercosur trade agreement. Cyprus taking over the rotating EU presidency in January 2026, emphasizing EU autonomy, security, and global relations. Implementation of the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, a key climate, trade policy now in force. 5.2. Summary. Overall, the EU Commission's agenda for 2026 is built around 1. Strengthening EU sovereignty and competitiveness. 2. Modernizing defense and security cooperation. 3. Accelerating digital and green transitions. 4. Reinforcing the social model and quality of life. 5. Managing migration and borders effectively. 6. Championing global engagement and trade. 7. Delivering on research, innovation and budget priorities. This reflects an integrated approach to internal and external challenges facing the EU in 2026. 6. EU Commission Agenda Timeline 2026. Q1. January to March. Focus. Launches, early budget implementation, new presidency agenda. January. Cyprus assumes EU presidency, emphasizing autonomy, defense, and security. Proposal for early access to EU agricultural funds to support farmers. EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, enforcement begins. Key meetings on Mercosur trade deal support and agriculture policy. February. Launch of digital sovereignty initiatives, new infrastructure and AI strategy discussions, review of defense collaboration measures under ReArm Europe. Initial social and employment proposals, including Quality Jobs Act consultations. March. Commission updates Migration and Asylum Implementation Plan. Rollout of funding calls for research and innovation under Horizon Europe 2026-27. Publication of mid-year progress report on EU competitiveness and regulatory simplification. Q2. April to June. Focus. Legislative proposals and global engagement. April. Submission of legislative proposals for industrial decarbonization and climate tech. EU defense and border security legislation drafts expected. Preparations for European Research Area Act and biotech-related regulations. May. EU trade missions and diplomatic outreach, reinforcing Ukraine support and Mercosur talks. Mid-year review of social policy measures, housing, poverty reduction, employment rights, updates on digital infrastructure projects and cybersecurity measures. June. Draft budgetary allocations for late-year projects, including green transition and innovation funding. Evaluation of EU's climate commitments and CBAM results. Progress report on migration and asylum policy implementation. Q3. July to September. Focus. Implementation and follow-ups, EU Parliament collaboration. July. Launch of major research calls under Horizon Europe, AI in science, climate, biotech, review of EU defense and security collaboration with member states. August. EU-wide consultations on employment rights reforms and social protection measures. Updates on digital sovereignty programs, including EU cloud and AI projects. September. Autumn package of legislative proposals for competitiveness, digital, and green policies. High-level meetings on external trade agreements and global climate commitments. Q4. October to December. Focus. Reporting, budget closure, and next year planning. October. Annual EU Commission Work Programme Update for 2027 Planning. Review of defense and security progress, including readiness measures. November. Budget Implementation Report for 2026. Early discussion of Multi-Annual Financial Framework 2028-34. Updates on social policy outcomes, employment, housing, poverty reduction. December. Publication of Annual Progress Report on all priority areas, competitiveness, green transition, digital autonomy, defense, migration, and trade. Planning for 2027 legislative proposals and research funding. End-of-year high-level global engagement meetings and EU external relations review. 6. Key notes. Some initiatives are ongoing and not tied to a single quarter, for example, migration, asylum management, defense readiness, or Horizon Europe projects. Digital sovereignty, climate transition, and competitiveness are recurring priorities throughout the year. EU presidency priorities, here Cyprus in early 2026, can influence timing of legislative pushes, particularly for trade and defense. Subscribe to this channel to keep up to date with EU regulation.